The truth is, I never imagined I was capable of such a thing. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have dismissed the idea with a confident laugh. My marriage to Ethan, 15 years of shared history, was solid. Perhaps a little weathered, but built on a foundation of quiet, unshakable trust. Ethan. He was my Ethan. A structural engineer, a master of calculating stress load and designing reliable support. That same quiet, dependable order ruled our home. He never forgot to check the tires on my car. He meticulously organized the utility closet. He could build a mean, complex bookshelf, yet somewhere along the way, the sheer functionality had eclipsed the joy. The quiet competence had deepened into a silence I no longer knew how to navigate. The descent began with a peculiar loneliness, a hollow ache residing just beneath my sternum. Ethan and I would share the same table, discussing his firm's projects, my work at the high-end auction house, or our daughter Lily's gymnastics practice. But it was like listening to two separate broadcasts in the same room. The intimacy, the unspoken language of shared glances, the simple, reassuring pressure of his hand, had dissolved into a routine that was both comfortable and desperately confining. Then, there was Julian. He walked into the auction house one rainy Tuesday afternoon, all tailored confidence and bright, impatient energy. He was an antiques dealer, he said, drawn to the historical weight of our pieces. Julian had an intense way of focusing his entire world on you, making you feel, momentarily, like the most utterly fascinating creature alive. And he looked at me that way. He sought my opinion, not just as a sales representative, but as a woman. What was the story behind that old clock? What secret history did that tarnished silver conceal? It was profoundly intoxicating. Our clandestine connection wasn't a reckless fling in cheap, guilty bursts. In my mind, it was a profound, stolen romance. It was long, luxurious coffees that bled into afternoons, murmured confessions in quiet alcoves, and the electrifying thrill of a new notification on my secondary phone. With Julian, I felt seen. I felt interesting. The hollow space inside me began to rapidly fill with his electric attention, his easy laughter, and his glamorous tales of sourcing rare treasures across Europe. I rationalized it as necessary maintenance, a brief, private repair to my sanity. Ethan was so consumed by load-bearing calculations and blueprint revisions, I convinced myself he wouldn't even register my absence. I became an expert in the architecture of deceit. I invented mandatory inventory checks, emergency evening charity galas, and intensive historical preservation workshops. Ethan would simply nod, his gaze fixed on his CAD drawings or his structural analysis report. "That's wonderful, Evelyn. Enjoy your workshop," he'd say. I should have known better. Ethan was a structural engineer. His entire professional existence was dedicated to stability, detecting material fatigue, and noticing the slightest stress fracture before it escalated into a catastrophic failure. The shift in me was a seismic event in the foundation of his life. And he noticed. He simply chose not to react. The stress testing begins. The first visible crack in my perfectly managed secret appeared one raw, cold Thursday. I arrived home late, my cheeks flushed from cheap champagne and the exhilarating rush of an afternoon with Julian. The house was quiet. Ethan was in his home office, as usual, but on the mahogany credenza in the hallway, nestled next to the polished bronze sculpture, lay a single, perfectly cut amethyst geode. My breath hitched. It wasn't an anniversary. It wasn't a birthday. Had he found out? Was this a desperate, silent plea for connection? I picked it up, the crystal edges cool against my trembling palm. There was no note. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice thin. He emerged from his office, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, a mechanical pencil tucked securely behind his ear. He glanced at me, then at the quartz cluster in my hand. "Oh, that," he said, his tone flat, professional. The client from the high-rise foundation project sent the team a gift basket. There was one of these for each lead engineer. I thought you might appreciate the clarity. He gave a small, dismissive shrug and returned to his structural study. The rush of relief was so profound it left me leaning against the wall. A professional courtesy. A leftover. That was my Ethan. But a tiny, insistent voice in my mind whispered, why not the whole basket? Why just one, perfect, isolated piece? A week later, my secondary phone, the tether to Julian, died completely during a lunchtime rendezvous. I'd forgotten the charger. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. Ethan occasionally used my main phone to check Lily's school schedule. What if he tried to call me? What if he found the device? I rushed home, ready with a frantic story about a dead battery and a forgotten charger. Ethan was in the sunroom, assembling a complicated marble run with Lily. No trouble, he said, without looking up when I breathlessly explained my flustered state. I figured you were occupied. I used the calendar on the tablet to schedule Lily's piano lesson. Everything's logged. He smiled, a normal, domestic, fatherly smile, but his eyes, for the briefest, most terrifying second, seemed to analyze me. They looked like they were measuring the precise structural integrity of my alibi. Then the email started, not to me, but for me. Ethan began enrolling me in things. A weekend historical preservation conference across the state. A volunteer commitment organizing the annual Children's Museum charity ball. I thought you'd benefit, he'd explain gently. You're always saying you need to engage with the community more. It was utterly uncharacteristic. The Ethan I knew supported my ambitions, but never initiated them. Yet these activities shared one defining characteristic: they were all scheduled during the exact hours I typically reserved for Julian. I had to cancel on Julian twice, fabricating elaborate excuses about sudden family crises. My stomach began to twist with a permanent knot of frustration and corrosive guilt. But the masterpiece of his subtle counter-campaign was the family project. Out of the blue, Ethan announced he was constructing a complex, cantilevered gazebo in the backyard. Not just a garden shed, but a miniature structural marvel, complete with curved support beams, a multi-tiered roof, and a copper weather vane. It was a project that consumed his every spare moment. And he wanted my participation. Come on, Evelyn, he'd say, his voice gentle, his engineer's logic inescapable. You have the eye for detail. Help me align the vertical load on this column. Hold this beam steady. Lily would love it if her mother was part of the process. It was brilliant. He was pulling me back into the dense, tightly woven fabric of our family life with the one thread I couldn't cut, our daughter's joy. I found myself spending my stolen afternoons, not with Julian in quiet cafes, but in our backyard, my hands stained with sealant and covered in wood shavings. I'd watch Ethan, utterly absorbed in calculating the angles, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I'd feel a pang of something sharp and painful. It was more than just guilt. It was the crushing memory of us years ago, calculating the support needed for our first child's crib. We had been a team then. A stable system. Julian grew impatient. You're constantly busy now, he complained over the phone, his voice tight, the smooth varnish of his charm beginning to crack. Is there something wrong? Is it your husband? Did he finally develop a spine? No. No, of course not, I'd whisper, hiding in the dimly lit pantry. It's just a demanding time. Family obligations. It feels like you're retreating, Evelyn, he pressed, and the line went dead. That was the moment the illusion began to shatter. The fantasy I had been living in felt flimsy and cheap compared to the solid, tangible reality of the gazebo taking shape in my own backyard. My husband wasn't fighting me with anger. He wasn't accusing me with raised voices. He was rebuilding. And he was doing it with such silent, persistent brilliance that I hadn't realized I was holding the hammer for him. The final load-bearing test. The tension with Julian became a constant, high-pitched hum in the back of my mind. Our calls grew shorter, more strained. His initial charming patience had worn thin, revealing a petulant, demanding core I hadn't seen beneath the polished exterior. "I don't understand, Evelyn," he said sharply. "You claim you're desperately unhappy. Yet you're always playing house in your backyard. Make a choice." A choice. The word terrified me. It meant facing the consequences, hurting Lily, destroying the foundations of my life, enduring Ethan's quiet, devastating disappointment. Julian's fantasy was safe only because it was concealed. Forcing it into the daylight made it look dry and brittle. He wanted a distraction, not a partner with baggage. It was a Friday evening when Ethan unveiled the next phase of his silent, devastating campaign. We were clearing the dinner table, the silence between us charged with everything unsaid. "I've been thinking," he began, methodically stacking the plates. "We should take a proper trip. Just the two of us. Lily can stay with my sister." I nearly dropped the wine glass I was holding. A trip? We hadn't taken a trip alone in nearly 8 years. "Next weekend. I've already secured the booking," he said, his tone casual, as if he'd just renewed a subscription. "It's a secluded cabin up on the coast. I thought we could use some time to recalibrate the stress loads in our life." My mind raced. Next weekend was the weekend I was meant to meet Julian. He'd booked a suite at an exclusive coastal inn. A proper escape, he'd called it, a chance for us to be a real couple. "Ethan, I might have an inventory review scheduled for that weekend," I stammered, the lie tasting like rust in my mouth. He stopped stacking the plates and looked at me. He really looked at me. His gaze was calm, unnervingly still. "Cancel it," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the firmest, most direct instruction he had given me in a decade. This is more important. The following days were an agonizing exercise in retreat. I had to call Julian. His reaction was worse than I feared. "You're canceling for a weekend with your husband?" he sneered. "I see. When it comes down to it, you always choose the safe, predictable option. You're not the brave, unconventional woman I thought you were, Evelyn. You're just a coward." His words hit their mark with brutal accuracy. He was right. I was a coward. I had tried to live in two realities, and in doing so, I had proven myself unworthy of either. The execution. The trip arrived. Ethan drove, and the silence in the car was heavy with my shame. I kept waiting for the inevitable confrontation, the accusation, the emotional storm. But he simply drove, one hand steady on the wheel, playing the soft, nostalgic jazz we used to share when we were first dating. The cabin was beautiful, a perfect, isolated wooden structure perched on a cliff overlooking the gray, crashing Pacific. It was achingly romantic, a setting designed for reconciliation. "I'll manage the luggage," Ethan said, his voice soft. "Why don't you step out onto the deck? The load-bearing view is spectacular." I stepped outside. The crisp, salty air did little to clear the fog of my anxiety. I felt like I was standing on the platform, waiting for the executioner's final moment. When Ethan joined me, he didn't bring the bags. He held 2 mugs of steaming cider. "To us," he said, gently clinking his mug against mine. His eyes held mine, and in them, I saw no rage. I saw something far more chilling, complete and utter knowledge. "Ethan, I began, the confession bubbling up, desperate to be released. He held up a hand. "Don't, Evelyn. Not yet." He took a slow sip of his cider. "I want you to listen first. I want you to understand." He leaned against the railing, looking out at the turbulent sea. "About 3 months ago, I noticed a change in your frequency. A new, volatile energy, but it wasn't for me. It was for someone else. He stated it so matter-of-factly, as if detailing a failure in a structural joint. At first, I was angry. I considered demolition. Confrontation, screaming, throwing things. But what would that have achieved? It would have given you an emotional exit. It would have made me the angry, unreasonable spouse. I am an engineer, Evelyn. I don't demolish structures out of impulse. I assess the damage, I reinforce the critical supports, and I rebuild. He turned to look at me, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. So, that's what I decided to do. I decided to rebuild us. And to do that, I had to demonstrate the true value of the structure you were so carelessly ready to discard. My legs felt weak. I sank into a deck chair, the mug trembling in my hand. The geode, I whispered. The geode, the preservation workshops, the gazebo, he confirmed, listing the stages of his plan with clinical precision. Reinforcement. Making it harder for you to access him, forcing you to choose over and over again between a cheap fantasy and your substantial reality. Tears streamed down my face, hot and shaming. He had known. He had known everything, and he had been anything but passive. He had been fighting for me with a quiet, brilliant strategy one was too blind and selfish to see. And this trip? I asked, my voice a broken whisper. This trip, he said, his voice hardening, is the final phase. This is where you calculate the full extent of the stress I can apply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times and then held it out to me. On the screen was an email, sent to Julian Thorne's professional address. The subject line read, Final decision regarding directorship of the Venice Restoration Foundation. Read it, Ethan said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. With trembling fingers, I took the phone. The email was from a fictitious board member, addressed to Julian. Dear Mr. Thorne. Thank you for your continued interest in the senior directorship at the Venice Restoration Foundation. We were exceptionally impressed with your credentials and vision. However, following the mandatory final review, the board has decided to regretfully withdraw the tentative offer of employment. We have received highly concerning but verifiable information regarding your professional ethics and personal integrity. The documented instances of misrepresentation and calculated risk assessment are not aligned with the financial stability and trust required by the Foundation. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely. Dr. Elias Vance, Chairman of the Executive Oversight Committee. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. Venice Restoration. Directorship. Withdrawn. I looked up at Ethan, utterly bewildered. What? Julian applied for this. You're not on any foundation board. A slow, cold smile spread across Ethan's face. A smile I had never, ever seen before. It was the smile of a man who had orchestrated a complete, structural collapse. I am not, he said calmly. But Julian doesn't know that. The foundation is real. The job opening was real. Julian applied for it months ago, believing it was his career-defining opportunity. The entire hiring process for the last 6 weeks, the interviews, the background checks, the final selection, has been meticulously conducted by me. The world tilted on its axis. What? I created the email domains. I used a voice modulator and a secluded Skype account for the final interviews. I recruited an old college roommate, an excellent voice actor, to play the headhunter. I offered him his dream job, Evelyn. A career-defining role on the other side of the Atlantic. He took his phone back, his eyes never leaving mine. He was going to take it. He was going to leave in a month, and he would have begged you to go with him. But now. Ethan's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Now he has nothing. No job, no future in that career path, because I will be ensuring a very detailed and very discreet letter concerning his unethical conduct finds its way to every major auction house and institute in the country. And, most importantly, he doesn't have you. I was speechless. The sheer scale, the patience, the quiet brilliance of his revenge was breathtaking. He had not laid a hand on me. He had not begged. He had systematically, methodically dismantled the affair from the inside out, exposing Julian's hollowness and destroying his professional future. All without ever raising his voice. He called you comfortable and safe, Ethan said, his voice now laced with a steel I didn't know he possessed. But he was the one chasing security, a fancy title, a substantial paycheck. He was using you, Evelyn, as a distraction, an ego boost. And now he has nothing. That is my revenge on him. He stepped closer, looming over me where I sat, shattered. And my revenge on you, he said, his voice soft again, but no less terrible, is that you have to live with what you did. You have to live with the knowledge that I know. That I calculated every lie, every stolen moment, every structural flaw you introduced into our life. You have to look at me every day and see the man you betrayed, and the man who was intelligent enough, and cared enough, to fight for you in a way you never expected. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like concrete. You don't get the dramatic exit. You don't get to be the tragic heroine of a self-indulgent romance. You get to stay. You get to live in the life you almost destroyed, and you get to help me rebuild it. That, Evelyn, is your punishment. And mine. He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving me alone on the deck with the ruins of my affair, the crushing weight of my shame, and the terrifying, awe-inspiring realization of the man I had married. The revenge was complete. It was cleaner, colder, and more absolute than any crime of passion could ever be. He had not just won me back. He had held up a mirror and forced me to watch as the woman I thought I was, the woman I had become, shattered into a million pieces. We returned home from the coast, and the silence in our house was no longer empty. It was full of everything that now stood between us. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't punish me with words. His revenge was in his quiet competence, in the way he continued to calculate and build a life I was now merely occupying, a permanent, penitent guest in my own home. I ended things with Julian in a brief, tearless, final call. His furious, sputtering response only confirmed every single one of Ethan's structural analyses. He was a shallow vessel, and I had filled him with my own foolish dreams. Now we exist. We are parents to Lily. We are partners in domestic tasks. The gazebo stands in the backyard, a beautiful, haunting monument to our cracked foundation. I look at Ethan and I see the engineer who didn't demolish, but who rebuilt on the unstable soil of my betrayal. The love is not gone, but it is fundamentally different. Hardened by an unforgiving truth. His revenge was not to make me leave, but to make me stay, and to forever bear the crushing cost of the silence I broke. I live with my punishment, the profound daily understanding of the good man I underestimated, and the terrible price of being truly, completely known.